And he leaned over as other people were talking, and he said, your first degree is biology, right? And I said, yes. And he says, you're Pascale Champagne. And I said, yes. You're Philip Jessup. He says, yeah. And he said, what do you know about algae? And I said, well, it's green. And and then so the round table came to Philip, and he says, oh, Pascale and I will be extracting bio-oil from algae. And I said, okay, yes, we will. And to my right was Warren Mabey, who said, and I'll be doing the life cycle assessment. And that started I would say, close to 10-year partnership with lots of success. At that time, we were, I think some people called us research cowboys because we weren't too sure what we were doing. But I think we've, collaboratively been able to I look at algae growth and treatment of wastewater with algae, which Philip knows nothing about. He looks at the extraction piece, and we've even been, and then Warren would do the life cycle assessment of, we're saying this is greener, we're saying this is better, but is it really better?
That was a preview of my conversation this week with Professor Pascale Champagne, an expert in renewable resources, particularly water. Our wide-ranging conversation about water sustainability, the human side of science, and what the 90s action movie Terminator 2 can teach us about science, that's all coming up. My name is Ben Charland, and this is What on Earth is Going On, your weekly podcast for a world in flux. You can get all previous episodes and this one on the website, www.wogoshow.com. That's WOEGO show.com. If you have any feedback or questions or suggestions for future episodes, send me an email, wogoshow@gmail.com. And finally, if you like this show, whether it's as a first-time listener or a regular subscriber, please spread the word. Tell your friends and family. Give the show a rating on Facebook or iTunes or whatever podcast app that you use. And share the episode or your favorite one on social media. The handle is @WogoShow. And as always, please keep the conversation going. Start your own discussions about the major events, characters, forces, and ideas that shape the human story today. Now, on the agenda for this episode is water, a simple substance and a basic human need that we in the West often take for granted. Yet there are communities here in Canada, a country that has perhaps the largest store of this natural resource, which are desperately lacking as if they were located in a totally different country. In fact, there are more than 1 billion people who lack adequate access to clean water. What is happening to water culturally, politically, physically? How does it fit into geopolitics? What is the science of water sustainability? And what about the water that comes out of your tap or the stuff you pour down your kitchen sink? There are unintended consequences all over the place, and we're just starting to understand them. It's not just about treating water with chlorine or fluoride or the prevalence of bottled water. Everything that goes down the sink or is dumped into the ocean or fed into a river, all of it stays in the system. All of it comes back. The antibiotics, the cleaning solutions, the chemicals that make food taste good and last forever. And the ibuprofen you take for your migraines, it doesn't all just get shoved into some barrels in the desert. These substances simply join the ecosystem, our ecosystem. It seems to me that we don't think about this clearly or deep enough, if at all. And let's not forget how many watchers of the world order believe that in the coming decades, water will become much like oil was in the 20th century, as it becomes scarcer in a clean form, with a growing population and a growing middle class who use much more water. It will be fought over and hoarded, a resource that nations seek to control, a lever of world affairs, a source of conflict. Arguably, the water crisis has already begun. By 2040, most of the world will not be able to meet its water needs year-round. At the end of the film The Big Short, about the 2008 financial crisis, the closing titles talk about Michael Burry, the investor and hedge fund manager who predicted the collapse of the housing market that almost everyone else thought was solid. Indeed, they took it for granted. The film reveals that his investing now focuses on a single commodity: water. Joining me for a conversation about all of this is Pascale Champagne, professor of both civil and chemical engineering at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. She's also the director of the Beatty Water Research Centre and the Canada Research Chair in Bioresources Engineering. Oh, and if you're wondering what a Canada Research Chair is, we talk about that too, as well as a bit about the human side of science and what we can learn from that film, Terminator 2. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did.
All right, Pascale Champagne, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming on.
I've been looking forward to this, having a chat with you.
Yeah, me too. You do some really interesting stuff in civil engineering at Queen's University, and you're also the director of the Beatty Water Research Centre. Is that right?
That's correct.
So I want to talk about renewable resources, and I really want to focus on water, a really important aspect of the world of Canada, of renewable resources, of energy production, and of course of geopolitics too, when we think about it. But before we do, I've got my first question, which is always the same. Pascale, what on earth is going on?
Well, that's a very loaded question, especially when you mention all those things, natural resources, the politics surrounding those resources, especially in Canada, because we are very rich in our natural resources. Mm-hmm. So what on earth? Well, let's start with Canada.
Okay.
I would say water, as you mentioned that as one of the things you want to talk about, is very... we have lots of it in Canada, except that we still have regions within our country where we have boiling water advisories, water issues. I think there was some news a few months back talking about, or a few years back as well, talking about how we have third world countries in a country like Canada, right. which is probably why we've taken a large focus, if we look at the research models and some of the strategic objectives right now in improving those conditions, mm-hmm. especially for our indigenous communities.
Mm-hmm. As a resource, water is critical on the global stage, and Canada is a big player. When I was a kid, and this is a bit of an anecdote, but when I was a kid, I think it was my dad who told me, remember that in the end, the Americans will come for the water. And what he meant, and it surprised me at the time, I said, well, what is that? What do you mean they'll come for the water? Why wouldn't they come for the uranium or the oil or something like that? But in the end, water is the one thing that we all need pretty much more than almost anything else. Maybe air would be one other thing we need as well, more than water. But that it's not a resource that's just going to be here forever no matter what we do. I mean, as you just mentioned with these boil water advisories, there are places in the world and in Canada where water is not something that's easily accessible because it's either polluted or it's not even there. I know that you're not dealing with water as a geopolitical resource, but obviously this is a big part of the conversation, where water is seen by all of these different people in all these different fields in the world as something that they want to control. Do you find that impacts not only your research, but the Beatty Water Research Centre, that we're talking about the larger issues at play when it comes to politics or culture or anything like that? Or are we dealing mostly with the water as a resource on the science of it?
Well, I think what we've tried to do with the Beatty Water Research Centre, at least what we're aiming to do, is really to take a different approach on how we view research center. And I know that a research center, I realize the Beatty Water Research Centre is called, it's got the word research in it. But that research isn't meaningful unless we can translate that knowledge. And that knowledge needs to be translated to politicians. It needs to be translated to the public at large. So they need to be aware of what's going on, not just in terms of the cool things we can do with research, sure, and using water as a natural resource, but also in terms of putting it within that geopolitical scale, as you mentioned. So what we're doing with the Beatty Water Research Centre, that's possibly unique across the country, is we're really focusing on our three pillars. So there is the research aspect, and we're in an academic environment, so that's critical. And that research is multidisciplinary. I firmly believe that you cannot do good water research with just having civil engineers. Infrastructure is important. Understanding infrastructure, putting the right infrastructure in place is critical. But ultimately, we need to have those other pieces: the biology, the chemistry, the geography, the geotech aspect, the hydrotech aspect. How does water move? All those things are critical, and you need to integrate those. And what better place to do it in a place where people are doing research that has a similar objective in terms of understanding it better and making sure it's available. The next piece is really the education piece. So how do we translate that knowledge to the general public? And what I'm quite proud of that we've done with the Beatty Water Research Center is really take that to a level that's meaningful. We have activities, the Water Festival every year, which is with grade 4 kids. So we bring them out into Lake Ontario Park. We have industry partners, RBC, Utilities Kingston, conservation authorities, and that group is growing, and I'm probably leaving out some people, but I know I'm leaving out some people, but it's really about educating those grade 4 kids in terms of water and why it's important in a multifaceted level. And then we hope that they go home and they talk to their parents about this. We have field days with grade 7, 8, 9, 10 kids. We also have activities that, so we have Art the Science program, which this year we're focusing on water, which is really about focusing on a different aspect of knowledge translation. Not everybody looks at it from a scientific or a business point of view. Some of it look at it from an artistic point of view. And so that's we think that's very important. The next piece is also, and this is a bit of a shameless plug on my part, is we'll be putting together a diploma program with which is not approved yet, but hopefully will be approved by the time this is broadcast. And it's the first diploma program will be on water and human health, and it's at the graduate level. And again, it's about credentialization, so young professionals or old professionals who are out there, new graduates who might want to get those credentials on a graduate level, they can do that. Then the final piece is outreach, which I've already touched on with some of the activities that take place within the community.
The common theme in everything that you're saying seems to be education, whether it's outreach or dealing with grade 4 students or 7, 8, 9, 10 on field trips or doing these activities into the community. You're dealing with a lot with, and you're trying to educate people about not just water, but about these natural resources that we not only have, but are responsible for. What are the key points that you want to get across? So if a grade 4 kid goes home, what do you want him to understand about water and about natural resources that he wouldn't have understood before? Obviously, at some point, he's going to know that water is necessary for life, that it should be clean, that not everybody has it. But what else does he need to know, or do you want him to know, or her, about these things that he wouldn't otherwise know?
I think conservation, we all think we do conservation well, and I think we can do conservation better. And that's with any of our natural resources. And it's not just about, sometimes we know things, we know it.
Yeah.
But do we really know it? Know it to do it on a daily basis without thinking about it? Think back in the day when composting and at-source, separation and all that and recycling came about. You're probably a little too young to remember that, but there was a time where everything went to the garbage.
No, I remember a time when if someone did compost, it was odd. Like they were trying hard if they were composting. They were the odd person in the neighborhood, and wow, they make an effort, but most people just throw it in the garbage. You're right. No, I do remember that time.
And it's easier to do that, so where we started educating our people, especially within Ontario, was really at the school level.
Right.
And then the kids go home and they say, "Hey, Mom, Dad, we just need a blue bin that we can throw the paper in," right? That was probably the first source separation. And then we went on to plastics and things like that. And now we're doing composting. And it's messy and it's smelly and it's not always great. And there's been lots of debate on whether, having multiple trucks go by is better for the environment on a life cycle assessment point of view. But ultimately, those are some of the questions academics can ask
Right.
and answer, and in collaboration with industry partners. So that's the other piece. I think I'm going off on a tangent,
No,
but
please.
that's important. Is academic research in some fields you can do research on your own, but I think within the engineering field, and especially when we're talking about resource management, doing it in a vacuum does not lead to good implementation of results.
Right.
It yields great results scientifically, but ultimately, if we want the public or municipalities or companies to adopt certain things, I think they need to be at the table. They have to have a bit of skin in the game, and or to be feel that they're being promoted for being green or thinking innovatively. And I have to say that I've been very fortunate. I've worked with industry partners like Utilities Kingston, Metro Vancouver, who are very forward thinking in how they want to approach having a green city, and I think that's important. Those partnerships make the research very meaningful from an engineering perspective.
Yeah, this is something that struck me on the website for the Water Research Center, which is that you're saying we don't want to be on the periphery of knowledge. We want to be at the center. And furthermore, we need this to be an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approach. We need to bring other people in from other fields, because this crosses over into everything. This is not just a few academics in a room trying to think things up, or one in a room trying to think things up. This is everybody working together. When it comes to that, this collaboration for conservation and resource management, what are we, and I mean we in Kingston, we in Ontario, we in Canada, we in the West, we on planet Earth, what are we doing right, and what are we not doing right? What are we missing? But what are we getting?
That's a very interesting question. I would say models evolve at different times. So if I can clarify what I mean by that. So the academic model, for example, is very much about, as a researcher, I would need to demonstrate that I'm able to conduct independent and autonomous research. So collaboration on that level makes it very difficult to demonstrate your autonomy. However, I think that thinking is evolving, because we all agree that needs to change. And even if you look at the funding that's available from our Canadian government, always tends to, the big grants tend to really favor those who do multidisciplinary or collaborative research. So we're getting there. But the old model is still the old model, and that's not just in Canada. That's pretty much in the world in an academic setting. But we don't want to take, because researchers do really a lot of very creative research on very little money. So there's been some studies done about looking at where our research dollar goes, and I would say we make it go really far. So as Canadians, we can be proud of that. But I still think the government, it would be nice for the government to sink in more funding or to prioritize some of that independent research. So we do research well with very little. However, I would say the flip side of that, from a research perspective, is as much as I like and I've done well by the partnership with industry model for funding, I would say that what gets lost if we focus too much on where will these results what will they give us in the next 5 years, like what predictor outcome, to me that's not research. If I know what the outcome of my research is going to be, I'm really doing incremental research. I'm not doing fundamental, groundbreaking research. But both are important. Both are critical. And I think that both need to have a voice in our budget model, for our government budget model for funding research. Because, yes, the industry partnerships are great, but not all great research will lead to an immediate result that's going to be beneficial and financially and economically viable within the next 5 years. And you're probably wondering why I keep saying that. It's one of the questions that probably most researchers always go, oh my God, we have to answer this question as part of the proposal. And if you don't get the money. So we try to be creative in our answers too.
Right. Speaking of creativity, I want to get back to resource management and to water, but I first want to talk about collaboration. It's such a key part of what you do. It's such a key part of the Water Research Center, but it's also, as we're talking about, a key part of what academia needs to be and needs to embrace. So, in your opinion, what is a good collaboration? What defines a good collaboration?
Somebody who it's involving people who bring a different aspect to the research program. So if I work on wetlands and I only collaborated with people who did wetlands, they may focus on a different part of wetlands. But I would say it's not that the research would be incremental, but the results would not be as groundbreaking unless
Right.
we were really focusing on one piece that's been plaguing the research community for years. So from my perspective, the people I collaborate with, and I can give an example, we had a research project that's just ended that looked at production of biofuels from algae. And the funny story is the way this collaboration started was actually quite interesting. We were sitting in a round table, probably about 20 researchers, and we were brainstorming an Ontario Research Fund application, which is multi-million-dollar. And at some point, I was sitting next to, on my left was Philip Jessup, who does green chemistry. And he leaned over as other people were talking, and he said, your first degree is biology, right? And I said, yes. And he says, you're Pascale Champagne. And I said, yes. You're Philip Jessup. He says, yeah. And he said, what do you know about algae? And I said, well, it's green. Mm-hmm. And and then so the round table came to Philip, and he says, oh, Pascale and I will be extracting bio-oil from algae. And I said, okay, yes, we will. And to my right was Warren Mabey, who said, and I'll be doing the life cycle assessment. And that started I would say, close to 10-year partnership with lots of success. At that time, we were, I think some people called us research cowboys because we weren't too sure what we were doing. But I think we've, collaboratively been able to I look at algae growth and treatment of wastewater with algae, which Philip knows nothing about. He looks at the extraction piece, and we've even been, and then Warren would do the life cycle assessment of, we're saying this is greener, we're saying this is better, but is it really better? And I think from advancing the field perspective, we've really built a team that was meaningful. We've collaborated with the algal carbon flagship out at Dalhousie, which really did fantastic work on algae. And that's sometimes you got to take a leap of faith and say, okay, I know these are great researchers in their own right. And I think that together we may not answer the question that we said we would do exactly,
right,
but we're definitely either going to come up with more interesting questions or more interesting answers.
Yeah, I had Warren Mabey on the program, and every time I think of him now, I think of Warren Beatty because of the Beatty Research Center. But I was going to say
I'm sure he'd like to have some of those resources at his disposal.
No kidding. Yeah. No, we had a great conversation about renewable resources, and we talked a lot about the Fort McMurray wildfire and his background in forest fires, which is so interesting because you never know where you're going to go, right? A lot of people advise if you're going to go start a book, whether it's a book or a novel or nonfiction or whatever, a lot of people say, always remember that the book you start writing is not the book you're going to finish, ever. It's always going
to... I would say it's the same thing in research.
Right.
What you start out with, you meet the deliverables and objectives that you set out to meet. And sometimes some of those objectives you say, that sounded like a good idea at the time, but it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. But if we do this instead, that works.
But that's the whole idea of growth and learning and discovery is it's not just discovering pieces to put into the puzzle. It's discovering how you put the puzzle together as you do it and finding new ways to put the puzzle together.
And that's where those partnerships, those
right.
collaborations, as you mentioned, are critical because you can't always think yourself out of the box if you're stuck, if you only have people who think like you.
Yeah.
And so trusting that you have, or taking a leap of faith on some people, sometimes evolving collaborations, you want to make sure that you have people that you know will be able to bring something different that's really going to make the research more meaningful.
Right. I think there's another aspect there too, which is the gumption to start a project that you might not be prepared for, or you might not know enough about. Like, for example, your story just now, that you knew that algae was green, and then all of a sudden you did a 10-year project about algae because of the gumption and the willingness to just go with it. I have a friend who's a video editor, and he makes a living editing videos. But his whole career in this started because he applied for a job that he knew he couldn't do, almost as a joke. It was to edit a video. He'd never edited a video. He never did a course in video editing or production or anything. So he got the job because he was able to lie and sell himself, and then all of a sudden downloaded some crappy software off the internet, and a week later he knew how to edit the video. Now, am I advising anybody to go that direction to start a career? Well, no, but he not only had the gumption, but once he had taken it on, he had the fear, and you need to get this done. You better figure out what algae is pretty quickly, or you're not going to have this job for much longer. And I think that pressure, I think, creates a lot of innovation and collaboration and results in the end when we force ourselves forward into a position we might not have been comfortable with or prepared for to begin with.
And I would argue, and this is to also promote those who do research where they do something meticulously and well. That's important as well. You can't have a whole bunch of research cowboys out there doing, the going through the jungle and looking at things. You need to have some people behind who really put the infrastructure in place,
right,
and set the rules and how things should be operated. So I think if you look at multidisciplinarity from a even broader sense, you need the researchers who'll do the things I wouldn't be able to do because I need that kind of drive that will allow me to step out of my comfort zone, whereas some people need to be in their comfort zone to do fantastic research. So both are important, and I think especially when we're talking about natural resources, both are critical.
Mm-hmm. You need to have a sort of a division of cognitive labor, right? You need to divide people into being able to do what they're good at, but also what they're passionate about and interested in, I think, in the end too. To go back to natural resources and to water, what are the big challenges that you're trying to overcome? Like, obviously there are specific ones in your research and in your partner's research, but what are the overarching challenges that are facing us and you in your work?
What I think is really on a lot of people's minds, especially after the summer we've had, is how will climate change affect our natural resources? Right. And I'm not a climate change expert. My focus, for example, is really on the government set these new effluent discharge guidelines and for wastewater, which I think is really important and really smart. But we have a number of small, remote, rural communities who just don't have the tax base to be able to or the knowledge, technical base to be able to have a full-time wastewater treatment plant and experts there. Thinking who wants to move to Pond Inlet and as an engineer and live there permanently so they can operate a wastewater treatment plant. So my group focuses on really understanding how the naturalized systems work, because really we think that in small, remote, and rural communities, that's what is going to be the most logical type of treatment. But then you have others who say, okay, well, globally, we need to worry about, so I think that's critical. But others will think globally, okay, so we have water, wastewater, emerging contaminants, all these things, and we have a changing climate. So how's that affecting the natural resources where we're getting our water? So now we're beyond just wastewater treatment. We're talking about natural resources that are getting these pollutants into that are receiving those pollutants And some pollutants we're just learning how to detect, and they can be quite detrimental to. So how do we manage that? How do we understand that? And how do we understand that when we have a changing climate where we may have some regions that used to have lots of water have less water, regions that used to have less water have more water, and how do we, from an engineering perspective, then manage the infrastructure to be able to handle all that, because the infrastructure is where people live.
Do we have any ideas of how we're going to do that? I mean, obviously we can't say how climate change is going to make Canada look in 20, 50, 100 years. People have some ideas, but we don't know for sure what it's going to look like. But do we have some ideas of how to future-proof our country, so to speak?
I think one of the projects we're looking into right now is really how can we use more sensitive environments, so environments like the northern environment, like the Arctic, but even a little bit below that. How are changes there? So what's changing there, and how does that impact that more natural environment, because there's less infrastructure. Right. And then how do we populate? So how do we get enough data so that we get a clear enough picture so that we can then translate some of that knowledge and apply it to temperate region, or like a more temperate climate where there's more infrastructure, more people, possibly less sensitive environment, but when we look at the impact on population, the impact could be amplified. So we're trying to develop models to be able to translate knowledge that we have from certain more remote watersheds where we can do a little bit more testing that's unimpeded by human activity, and then be able to translate that knowledge or some of those findings in how that would impact a more southern or temperate climate.
Interesting. And we're talking also about the things that individuals can do. I mean, obviously, a big reason for education is to make sure that we use our resources properly. And so not just the way that governments and businesses act on a large scale, but how we individuals act as well. So typically, what are we not knowing that we should know when it comes to wastewater or the use of water? I mean, surely it's not just use less water. I mean, there must be other things at play as well.
Well, what you put down the sink, for example,
okay.
that's a simple thing that we can fix, right? We tend to, it's a lot. Anything liquid can
just
go down
right
the
sink,
yeah,
right.
or in the toilet or whatever. But ultimately, that goes to the wastewater treatment plant, and not everything gets removed. I think
before the water is put back into the cycle, right?
Because. And it's not to say that municipalities aren't doing a great job, but there's contaminants. We're introducing new chemicals into, look at the pharmaceutical industry, look at the nutraceutical industry. We are introducing new chemicals into our bodies and into the environment more quickly than we're adapting infrastructure to be able to treat them. So, and I would say most of the so if you take aspirin or Tylenol, vitamins, all kinds of new health things, our body only assimilates a certain portion. So you have to think of, with all the things we're putting in our bodies to be healthier, how much of that is actually absorbed by our body. Yeah. And in some cases, it's less than 20%.
Yeah.
So the rest has to go somewhere. And so we're trying to live. So the concept of living a healthier lifestyle is great, but we don't know how all these things that we're taking as supplements and things to make ourselves healthier will impact our environment.
Well, and we do know that these things are showing up in our water supplies.
Yes.
I mean, this is something that in research for this show I looked into, and that there are anything that people imbibe will find its way into the drinking water supply after water treatment, because no water treatment plant can take out everything. I mean, the only true way of getting water that's not contaminated by all the Tylenol that people take is by going to a creek in the Rocky Mountains. But then I suppose even then the water is still coming in the cycle of our planet. going from water into the air, dropping over the mountains and coming back through that creek again. So we're dealing with, as you say, chemicals that not only do we not even know that these chemicals are pollutants, or we're learning that they are pollutants, but that the things that we thought should have been taken out are still there in trace amounts. I mean, there's something about antibiotics. Like, there are antibiotics in the water supply which are eventually creating superbacteria that are resistant and resilient to any kind of treatment because they are exposed to such a wide, an enormous amount of people. I guess my first question to that is, what do we do about something so prevalent and so massive of a problem?
Education
Right.
is key. And I think as Canadians, what we need to realize, and I think with some of the media that we've received in recent years, with some of the critical drinking water issues or accessibility issues for some communities, we're more aware of that, is that just because we have lots of clean water now, it's we shouldn't take that for granted. We don't know what the next 50 years will do. The Great Lakes didn't used to always be very clean, but right now, I would say in Kingston, it's really funny. I hear people complain about the water in Kingston, and it's, tastes funny and it tastes like chlorine.
Yeah.
And except that it's one of the best, from a water quality perspective, drinking water quality, it's one of the best in the country.
Really?
Yeah. And so they take bottled water, and I actually would argue that bottled water is less regulated than municipal water. So if a municipality is able to provide you clean water, that is more regulated than the water that you would get from a water bottle. And so I would say, you're removing the chlorine if you don't have the chlorine input. Chlorine is there as a disinfectant. It's there in concentrations that will not be harmful to the human body. It's an acquired taste, but that's in any municipality that you go to, the water will taste different.
Right, of course.
Because it's really dependent on the source. When I lived in Guelph, it took me a while to get used to hard water, but hard water is actually really healthy for you.
Oh, is it?
Well, you think about it. So, hard water, typically, the reason it's considered hard water is it's got cations, so calcium, magnesium, potentially a little bit of iron. And yes, from a waterworks perspective, it's not great because it creates issues with laundry and things like that. So soap doesn't lather as well. But from a drinking water perspective, I used to laugh at some of my friends who would use Beretta filters to remove all the hardness ions, but then they would load up in multivitamins. And I say, okay, so your multivitamins have calcium, magnesium, iron,
right,
which you've just removed from your water.
It's almost like you want to use a Brita filter for your laundry.
Well, yes, and that's why you would use so if you look at most water softeners in homes where there's hard water, you use it for not your drinking water. You use it, and not for your lawn. You would use that water for laundry, showering, so that your soap will lather the way it should and not leave a deposit. So ultimately, those are the little things that, and then what I always tell my second year class, I teach a course on chemistry or chemistry for civil engineers, is, so, how many people use a Beretta filter? So how often do you actually change your filter? Because if you've concentrated all those contaminants and those bacteria start to grow, and you don't change your filter, ultimately you're creating an environment that's notably worse than it was when you started. So just a little cautionary note.
I think a key theme in our conversation now, but also in the show going back, is literacy and science literacy, and the role of science and understanding what science is about, whether it's in education with 4-year-olds or grade 4s or grade 7 through 10, or in this conversation now, to understand what science is about, why it should be trusted. And to understand what the language of science is. So when someone says something to me, I can interpret it and judge its value based on what I know about what science is. So if someone says, for example, that the world is flat, I know that they don't know what they're talking about because I can judge it based on what science has said.
And
I'm
Google
from
Earth, of
and
course.
right and any like just yeah, it's not even it's such a silly argument. But I'm from Calgary originally, and in Calgary there is remaining today a debate about fluoride in the water supply. Now, this is very interesting because there are very, very smart people on both sides of the debate, but it's become a very emotional issue because it's not just some abstract idea that we're talking about what would be better for the population. This is something that people drink and use every day. And of course, scientists have said there is enough fluoride in the water to have a benefit, but not so much that it causes any harm to anybody in any noticeable way. So how could you argue with that? Well, people just feel, well, they're lying to us. There are many Calgarians who feel it's a conspiracy to make money from it, or it's a whole other debate I don't even want to get into. What I'm trying to say is that literacy forms a big part of this. And if you don't have a literate population that understands, for example, that hard water is actually good for you and doesn't need to be filtered out, despite of the obvious other problems that might arise from it, if I'm not scientifically literate, just as an average citizen, then I won't be able to constructively help the debate. I may even hinder it because in Calgary, fluoride was taken out of the water supply, and I don't know enough about it, but it seems to me that it's important for people to understand not as much as you understand, obviously, as a scientist, but understand the basics of it so that they can make the right decisions as citizens in our democracy. Do you think that's a valuable judgment? And do you find that science literacy is something that you are trying to achieve in education?
Well, I think with the Beatty Water Research Center, we recognize that water is it's a resource. It's critically important to human life, as you mentioned earlier, and it's our responsibility, social responsibility, to educate not just our students who are in program, but also take our knowledge and translate it so that it's understandable. That may not be the case in all types of research. If you're, studying, the stars, for example, not to put down that I think that's one of the coolest areas of research, but, supernova will not affect us immediately. But with water, we're looking at a very short timeline in terms of impact, whether it's clean, it's not clean, treated, scarcity, climate change, all of those things could impact our lifestyle and within our lifetime, but more importantly, within our kids' lifetimes. So we want to make sure that they have the same benefits and carefree-ish lifestyle that we have compared to other areas in the world. So I think earlier you asked me, what do we not do well? And I would say as academics, what we could do better is really that knowledge translation piece. There are some programs out there that tend to focus on that. Not all of them are with scientific research, so they may be more on the social side. There's some opportunities to look at that kind of knowledge translation piece, but it's difficult to assess whether. So as a researcher, when an academic, when I come in and I look at, all right, I have, if you think of a research program, it's like running your own little mini business. I have to apply for funding. I have to hire people. I have to talk to industry partners. Once I get the grants, if I get the grants, because some of them are like 15% success rate. Wow. So now I need to make sure that I'm communicating or reporting, not communicating, reporting my results are important. And to me, the reporting of the results is not necessarily translating the results. That's a different piece. But within the framework of what I'm being assessed at as an academic, I get assessed as to whether I've written papers, how many grants I've had, and I have to write the final reports if I want to get more grants. And so it's not that the knowledge translation piece is not as important. It's just not as critically valued within science and engineering, for example.
Right.
And so that's a simple fix. We just change the model so that there's an equal weighting to knowledge translation as there is to academic papers that you get. So it's really that academic currency and that's foreign to most people who are not in an academic environment.
Right. But it's fascinating. A lot of academics tell me that that the model is broken or it's problematic in a lot of ways because it produces a lot of reporting, as you say. They write a lot of papers, they can get a lot of grants, but that doesn't necessarily translate into anything actionable. And almost a lot of the knowledge goes into the vacuum, or it's not disseminated. There may be a lot of incremental discovery made on a certain subject, but because it doesn't go anywhere, it's as if it never happened.
Well, it's disseminated. I'll correct you on that one. It's disseminated to, and actually I had this conversation with my youngest child who's going into biomedical mechanical engineering at Ottawa U. And what they were saying was they worked in a lab with Philip Jessup this summer, and they said the piece that's missing is why what I'm doing is important. So not from their research. Their research, they knew what their role was in the project, but listening to other people give talks within the research group, it was, the simple question that we all as parents hate our 3-year-old saying, but why?
Yeah.
But why? But how do you know? And as a parent, do you remember, this is an annoying question because it never ends and you try, why is the sky blue? Because of but how do you know?
Yeah. I know because of this, but why? But why? But why?
But who told you?
Yeah.
And how do you know that's true? And God, I think the 3-year-olds have a better wisdom on this than we do.
I've got the silliest reference for you. Have you ever seen the movie Terminator 2?
Yes.
So do you remember the part where the Terminator is asking why? He does this. He does it like a child does it. And I think it's actually a really clever scene, and maybe I'm making way too much of it, but the Terminator is a machine sent back to protect John Connor or whatever, and but John Connor gives him an order, and the machine says why, and then he answers, then why, and then he answers, then why. But what it's saying is that the question why, which we often roll our eyes at, is extremely important. That's why the 3-year-old asked the question. I remember doing that. I remember doing that to my parents and to my elders and asking why, because I thought maybe we'll get to the end of the rope, the end of the chain, and find the final question of why, which of course there isn't. That's ridiculous. It goes on forever. It's ad infinitum. But the desire to find out what's behind it, I think, is crucial, especially in what we're talking about. In academia, in natural resource management, the question of why will shape the work that we're doing, rather than let it be shapeless or unactioned.
And I think what we become very good at as academics, and that's why not everybody gets a PhD, is that we get comfortable, and you have to be comfortable with the fact that you will never have all the answers. Right. And to work in a space where nothing is ever complete, so it's tough to work in that environment. There's always going to be a new question. One of the reasons I did not want to do initially, I never had a clear path of I'm going to become a professor. If you told me this when I started university, I would have laughed. But ultimately, one of the reasons that I really questioned whether I would do a PhD and become an academic, and I think we all as PhD students eventually go through this crisis, I'm going to have to come up with new research questions and new topics, and that's a daunting realization. And then you realize once you're in it after so many years that there are always other questions, and the more questions you answer, the more questions there are, the more things you don't know. And most people don't work in that space, and so it's easy to say, but you should know this. And it's difficult to explain, well, we know this part of this, but we don't know this part. And these two parts work together. So even if I just answered one part, I still don't know the answer to two. And once I know the answer to two, the two work together. Hence the importance of multidisciplinary work and working on the periphery and thinking outside the box. We need to integrate things a little bit more.
Right.
And I think we're getting better at integration of knowledge.
Right.
So now we need to start working more on the translation piece.
Well, and speaking of the cycles of natural resources, there's this cycle of education. And going back to the ancestor of Western education, Socrates, who said that I know that I know nothing. That his great teaching at the time in ancient Greece was that you don't actually know. That the search for knowledge is not degraded by the knowledge that you don't know. It's enhanced. It's because it gives you this thirst to continue and to know more and try to discover more. It seems almost like a paradox, the fact that you don't really know anything and therefore try to know it so hard. It's almost the paradox of life. The fact that you will die means that you go on living and living well. And I don't mean to get too dark with this, but maybe that darkness is a segue into my last question for you, which is we've talked a lot about conservation and natural resources and education, but let's just see bluntly and ask bluntly, what do we think is going to happen if we don't act? If we don't act properly to preserve natural resources, especially water, what is all of this going to look like in 10, 20, 50 years? Like, what are the threats and how will they transform the world around us?
Well, if I can kind of shape that answer a little bit. So again, speaking with my youngest that's off to university, it's disheartening when I hear them say, do you know that we already know we've exceeded our capacity?
Yeah. And
this is a generation of children, and to me that's dark, because if they think along the same lines of other kids in that generation who are going off to university, who are planning futures, how do you deal with that as a teenager where you're coming out and you're saying, we've already globally exceeded our capacity?
Like the carrying capacity of the earth.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so as a parent, I think that's my next challenge. And to me, what I said to my child was, I have faith that we've always found ways. So look at so if you say that we'll have exceeded it in the next 50 years, look at how much technology, knowledge evolution has happened in the last 50 years. So working in a scientific environment, which is a very positive environment to work on. We always look at new things, new solutions, not, the end of things. I have faith that we will, and hope that we will overcome that. Mm-hmm. But this is a generation of children that we need to educate, that we need to give hope to. Mm-hmm. And so make them part of the equation, make them part of the solution, because ultimately it will be their burden to carry. So the sooner we make them part of that education piece and that solution piece, the better it is for globally for everybody.
Well, it's funny when you mention the word faith. It's a word that often is in opposition to science, right? But it's the word that in this conversation gives action to science. It's the one thing that says we need something from our discovery. We need something from our search of knowledge, because if we don't find it, then our hope is misplaced. And so that faith and that hope might actually, not to put it too bluntly, but give us, provide results. Not just be a report, but actually produce results. To go back to what we were talking about earlier. Just one last, what did we miss in this conversation? Anything that you thought we might have talked about that we didn't get to?
No, actually, this conversation took a completely different turn than I expected. But
what did you expect?
I thought we'd be talking about my research chair in bioresource engineering, which we have. And but no, I think we've touched on the human side of science.
That actually does lead to one last question, because I've interviewed a few Canada Research Chairs, and you're one of them, but I'm still struggling with what that means. So is it just a grant that's provided by the Canadian government, or is it more than that? Because when I see people who have that, they use it as a title in their academic resume. So what does it mean to be a Canada Research Chair?
It depends on if you look at it from a it depends on how you look at it. So to be a Canada Research Chair, I think you have to somewhat be recognized as a leading expert in research in Canada. And because it's peer reviewed, because it's, so it's an honor. If you look at it purely from a funding model point of view, the government has decided that you have expertise, so that it gives resources to the university to allow you to have more time to do research.
Right.
And that resource comes in salary form. But ultimately, I think that if I want to look at it from a more a nicer perspective, I guess, is that it's an honor to be recognized as a Canada Research Chair, and to, for people to acknowledge that that other experts, other academics have acknowledged that you're doing good work in this field, and we should encourage you to do that. So that's the way I look at it. And
I think the other side of the coin to honor is responsibility. That it's almost as if Canadian society has said, we're counting on you. That we've given you a responsibility, and we need you. We need your help, whether it's in your field or in philosophy, or because the Canadian Research Chairs are everywhere in every field. But it's essentially saying from society to the researcher, okay, we need you. We need something from you.
And it also says that if I use that title and say, Pascale Champagne, Canada Research Chair, said this, there's a responsibility that is true. Because the title, as you mentioned, comes with responsibility, and not everybody knows what the process is to be a Canada Research Chair. So to the general public, I have a responsibility that if I say something, that it's meaningful.
Backed up, yeah. Thanks so much for coming on the show. This has been a terrific conversation, and I'm glad it's been unexpected.
Okay. Thank you for having me.
Thanks.
That's the show. If you're really interested in this subject, I would recommend an episode of the Netflix show Explained. It's called The World's Water Crisis. Remember that you can get all previous episodes and this one at www.wogoshow.com. That's WOEGO show.com. There you can find links to social media. Please spread the word about the show. Give it a rating on iTunes or whatever podcast app that you use, and get in touch. Send me your feedback or your suggestions for future episodes. You can email me at wogoshow@gmail.com. Your quote of the week is from Benjamin Franklin. When the well is dry, we will know the worth of water. Thanks for listening. Hey, just a quick note to let you know that this show was originally broadcast on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, Ontario, Canada, and that you can also catch it every Tuesday on CHMR in St. John's, Newfoundland. Thanks again.